Well, this is the books and music review show. I'm going to take you over to the studio for a second. The books and music review show. There's your disclaimer. And today we're going to welcome back with a great book review. We're going to go right on over to you, Gerard.
Thank you for that warm introduction. Yes, today we're going to be looking at a book written by David Garrow, a civil rights historian. He wrote a book entitled Rising Star, The Making of Barack Obama. And as you can see, it's a very thick, it's a bit of a doorstop. It weighs 4 or 5 pounds probably, and it runs to around a little bit under 1,100 pages. There are 300 pages of endnotes, and the acknowledgments run, well, there are several hundred people listed in the acknowledgments, just to give you an idea of how comprehensive this book is, even when compared to famous historical biographers like Robert Caro or Ron Chernow. This is and political biographers like George Meacham, who wrote a book about a biography of George Herbert Walker Bush and the Bush family, which is around 700 pages. This is, or 600 pages. This is close to twice that length, and that was one of the main criticisms, or ostensibly that was a criticism leveled at at him by critics like Michio Kakuta, the famous New York Times book critic. The length, and it could have definitely used a slightly more hands-on editor. There are paragraphs where he delves into the grammatical errors that Barack Obama had in fundraising emails and emails when he worked for various nonprofits. And there are whole pages of fundraising totals during his Senate race. So it could definitely have been culled a little bit, but I think the real antagonism towards this really didn't have anything to do with the fact that it was lengthy, although it is, but the fact that it was a biography of Barack Obama, which was not hagiography. It was actually critical. It's not a book length cheap shot at him. David Garrow's not an ideological opponent. In fact, like I said, he's a civil rights historian. He's very liberal, and except for some personal issues of the way that Barack Obama approaches race, I would be shocked if he doesn't agree with Barack Obama on 90% of his political platform. I'm sure he voted for him twice, at least, in the presidential elections that Barack Obama ran in. So he's not coming at this to tear down or attack Barack Obama from a conservative perspective. He's very much in line ideologically with what Barack Obama believes, but he decided to do a fair and very thorough and extensive interrogation of Barack Obama's life story and his political persona, and I think that's he does a really I think he accomplished that in large measure. The fact that he was able to excavate his entire history, not only his political history and the history of his involvement in Chicago and Illinois and subsequently national politics, but his early childhood, growing up in growing up in Hawaii and being raised in Indonesia, I think this is a part of Barack Obama's life that a lot of people don't really appreciate. The fact that he was raised in a very foreign environment. He was born, I think, a couple of years after Hawaii was officially declared a state. It's kind of similar to how Barry Goldwater's life. Barry Goldwater was born when Arizona, I think, was still a territory. So Hawaii, even though it was part of the United States, it's a very new part of the United States. And he only lived there for a few years, and he was educated to a large extent before traveling back to Hawaii. He was educated in Indonesia, which is a completely foreign culture. It's the largest Muslim country on the planet, and so he had a very, I don't know if you would describe it as cosmopolitan, but he had a very different upbringing than a typical American candidate, sort of like how Kamala Harris, whose parents, one of them is from Tamil Nadu in India and the other is from Jamaica, how she was raised in Canada and is now the senator from California. It's not really a typical, it's not a very typical representative profile of someone who you would expect to be president. And I think that's why this story is so interesting, because he kind of examines all of these influences that impacted Barack Obama. And he also looks at the sort of novelistic approach that Barack Obama used to depict his own life, and with the goal of attaining high political office. And I think this is something a lot of people dislike about Barack Obama and about his presidency and his career. Not just right-wing people or conservative people. I think there are progressive and left-wing activists who also dislike this sort of carefully crafted, almost synthetic approach that he used to build his political career. And you could see this in books like Dreams from My Father, which was originally titled Dreams of My Father. And it is sort of a nonfiction novel. There are characters who are conflated and composited, different people composited into one individual. There are things that are exaggerated, particularly one incident that David Garrow looks at in the early part of this book is Barack Obama's invocation of this magazine spread about black children or black young people who lighten their skin with bleach. And he said that he had seen this as a young child growing up in Hawaii, and he alluded to the fact that this was published in a large, widely read photo news magazine, something like Life magazine or Look. And later on, people looked at this claim, and David Garrow examines it thoroughly in this book, and they found it to be completely fabricated. And eventually, Barack Obama had to backtrack and admit that he didn't remember the exact name of the magazine or the circumstances, but he used this as sort of a useful anecdote, a compelling or persuasive anecdote when he was running for office. It sort of the African American community, which was a very foreign community as far as he was concerned. And you see this, and David Garrow explores this in his book, how whether it was at Punahou High School in Hawaii or Occidental College or even at Columbia and later Harvard, he had very few African American friends, very close friends. I think there was one in his high school in Hawaii, but otherwise most of his friends were Pakistani or Korean. It was a very polyglot, multicultural tapestry of friends, but he didn't have that many close friends, hardly any, that were actually African American. And you get the sense from reading this book that when that was one of his main goals as he progressed, and eventually there was a moment when he was at Occidental College after a very listless academic career prior to that he decided that he wanted to become a political figure and eventually become president. And it was there that he realized that he needed to make inroads among the African American community, a community that was completely foreign to his upbringing and to his psyche, which is why one of the reasons why he got involved in as an activist, as a social activist in Chicago, because this was seen as the heart of Black America. And in fact, when he did eventually move to Chicago, he wound up living in Hyde Park, and his neighbors, some of his neighbors were Louis Farrakhan, who's the racist, anti-Semitic head of the Nation of Islam. It's not covered in this book specifically, but because the photos were disclosed years later after he had already left the presidency, but he was photographed standing next to a very jubilant Louis Farrakhan, and he was smiling himself. And these photos were hidden by the news media, which had a vested interest in protecting him. And this is another theme that recurs throughout Barack Obama's history. These sort of compromises he made in order to advance his political career. And one of the major compromises he made was not getting married to a woman who was like him, multiracial. She was Asian. She was Asian and white, and they had a very tumultuous relationship. But ultimately, they broke up because Barack Obama thought he wouldn't be able to advance politically as a biracial person. He wouldn't be able to advance without the support of the Black community, and not being married to an African American woman would be a hindrance to his electoral success. And that's one of the things that really resonates with this biography, the choices that Barack Obama made in order to succeed, to become the person, the political figure he ultimately became, a senator from Chicago and from Illinois, and a United States senator, and ultimately the president, because he ran in 2000 against Bobby Rush, who was a longtime congressman from the south side of Chicago, and who represented a predominantly African American community. I think his congressional district was upwards of 70% or 80% Black. And Barack Obama was completely shellacked in that campaign. One of the reasons being was that he was running against someone who was a Black Panther who was identified as the representative of this community, an heir to the civil rights struggle from the 60s. And this was a person who was identified as their representative, the representative of the Black community, particularly those who had experienced the civil rights era in that part of Chicago, which is a very racially stratified, segregated city. For those of you who don't remember, there was a march led by Martin Luther King after the Civil Rights Act had been enacted to oppose the housing racial stratification and it was met with a lot of animus and resistance by white Chicagoans. So Bobby Rush was seen as their representative, and Barack Obama was seen as an interloper of sorts, someone who was not an African American, who was biracial, and who had sort of been parachuted into Chicago from Hawaii, from Harvard Law School, from California, various different parts of the country that didn't really have an allegiance to this community, and he was destroying that race, and it kind of gave him the impetus to redefine himself in the public eye. And this is why so many of these associations that cropped up later on were he went to great lengths to suppress. The fact that he was not, if not friends with Louis Farrakhan, was at least on friendly terms with him and with other people in the Nation of Islam, something that a lot of people who would be surprised to learn, and this is one of the reasons I think this book is worth reading, is that David Garrow spoke with Barack Obama staffers, people who staffed his office as a state senator in Chicago, and they told him very directly he had members of the Nation of Islam working for him in his office. And I believe one of the people quoted says something to the effect of, well, I went in there and you would see women with scarves all the time. And this is said in a complimentary fashion. It's not intended, coming from this person, it's not intended as a slight. But that is basically what was happening during Barack Obama's campaign for the U.S. Senate. So he had to work diligently to cordon off and to sideline this aspect of his political persona. And he actually moved one of his closest aides, who was a member of the Nation of Islam, he moved her away from the public-facing role that she had been installed in. He kind of moved her away from that role so that it wouldn't attract negative publicity. And like I said, this is a recurring theme throughout Barack Obama's career, trying to minimize unpleasant associations that might benefit him politically in a very narrow sense. I mean, Chicago is a very strange city in that sense that you have grassroots political support for something like the Nation of Islam, which most people view with contempt, especially white people and people who are Jewish and people who don't belong to this cult. They view it with contempt. But there you have support for the Nation of Islam, even among black officials who aren't associated with it. religiously, or who aren't associated with Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam in terms of believing the same bizarre doctrines. They support them politically because it's seen as a beneficial sort of, I don't know how you would describe it, but it's basically seen as a good thing in the black community, especially a community like Chicago, which is riven by crime and drugs and deindustrialization. Another important facet of this book, and a reason that the book is so lengthy, is the amount of time devoted to explaining the underlying political and socio-economic problems within Chicago. There's a 50-page long preamble to the actual biography, which is included, that goes into the closing of several important steel plants by Wisconsin Steel and their parent, International Harvester. Excuse me. And he delves into this in very rich detail. The idea that this was a traumatic change in the lifestyle that tens of thousands of blue-collar, predominantly African American, but also Hispanic and white Chicagoans and Illinoisans were accustomed to. These were people who had very stable middle-class jobs that they used to provide for their families, and these plant closures basically devastated their lives. They weren't able to recover, and the lawsuits and political action related to these closures lasted from the time Barack Obama, about 6 years, I believe, before Barack Obama relocated, came to Chicago, all the way up through his time at the Harvard Law Review and his return to Chicago and election as a state senator. So this was a decade-long, multi-decade process that just eroded the moral fabric of this community. And David Garrow uses that as a building block to explain the
5 minutes.
Explain the political and socioeconomic forces that sort of went into providing a base for Barack Obama when he returned to Chicago. And another interesting aspect of this book is it's very revelatory in terms of how useless a lot of these nonprofits and a lot of these Saul Alinsky type groups are. And Barack Obama was not, when people say he was trained by people who were in the Saul Alinsky mode of political activism, but he was not an Alinskyite in the sense that he recognized the limitations of these groups, which essentially created a bunch of dependents, people who were reliant on lobbying of the local and state governments to subsidize them, and he realized the limitations of this. But even so, the groups he was involved in were just as not politically, but they were just as impotent in terms of producing a useful useful economic opportunities for their ostensible clients. The idea that these people were useful in terms of achieving job opportunities is just a complete and utter myth. There was no there was one group he was involved in, or one organization which spent tens of thousands of dollars and did not succeed in placing anyone in a job. And that's something that's a recurring theme in the David Garrow book. The idea that you have all of these organizations like Acorn, which was an early supporter of Barack Obama because he worked for Acorn affiliated groups. And you have groups like Acorn and all of these activist groups, these people who are career activists, and that's all they do. They've never held a job in the private sector.
3 minutes.
Although Barack Obama briefly worked for a corporation as an editor, but for their publications. But people who've never worked in the private sector, who have these career jobs, and they're being subsidized by the Joyce Foundation and the Woods Foundation and all of these very wealthy, ostensibly philanthropic groups that are throwing their money into organizations that don't produce anything for their clients. And their clients are the citizens, the people in the surrounding, very often impoverished communities, places like Outguild Gardens, housing projects in Chicago, which is discussed at length in this book, and they don't really generate any sort of returns on their investment. And I think that's one of the things that David Garrow does a great job, even if it's inadvertent, portraying in this book. And like I said, Rising Star, let me just hold it up, this Rising Star, The Making of Barack Obama. It's a really great book if you have the patience. I know a lot of people don't want to read a 1,000-page long book, political biography, even people who are interested in politics, but I think it is worth it if you have the time. And I would definitely recommend getting a hold of this, because like I said, it's the only biography of Barack Obama which isn't really a hagiographic portrait. This is not like the Ron Chernow biography of Alexander Hamilton. It's very, very thoughtful, and even when I disagree with certain conclusions the author comes to, I can appreciate the amount of effort and dedication it took into crafting this portrait of our last president. Anyway, so like I said, I would definitely check out this book if you are interested at all in this area, Rising Star, The Making of Barack Obama. And hopefully we can talk in the future about other former presidents. Anyway, thank you for watching.